Hey, Dean Lushniak, how are you?
Hey, Kelly, how are you?
Good, good. Thank you so much for joining us. And
Good, absolutely. How you been doing?
I've been doing well. Yeah, I've been doing well. And I feel like it's been such a long time since we last talked. But thank you,
I know.
everyone, for joining us. And also, wait, what does your mug say? That's such a cool mug.
Oh,
Love it. But thank you everyone for joining us and also everyone who came in on our last session asking questions about UMD's reopening process. And hopefully we can discuss more of that today, especially because we just got a few new emails this week from the school about testing before and after we get to campus. But please make sure to leave questions like as in the comments, or you could even add a question to the Instagram live video. So we would love to answer those in live time instead of just waiting at the end or the last 15 minutes to answer questions. But this week is the last summer session of the Instagram live series with Dean Lushniak and our special guest and myself. And over the past few months, we've discussed different plans for UMD reopening, state and local health departments and their roles in combating the coronavirus, racial inequities in healthcare, and then also just the job market during this tumultuous time and other varied topics. And it's been a really great time just to showcase different things like that and have so many professionals give their insight and answer questions. But as we always do, I would love for Dean Lushniak just to catch us up about where we are in the coronavirus pandemic right now, and then we could dive into different questions that we have about reopening schools and then also just the current events around coronavirus.
great. Thanks, Kelly, and welcome everybody. It's been a few weeks since we've had this, and so it's always great to see you all virtually out there. And it's great seeing as Kelly and I sort of look at our screens of people joining us all the time. So this session today is really an ability to sort of catch you sort of catch up time in terms of where we're at, both as a society when it comes to COVID-19, as well as a campus community and as a school. Looking now at the dashboard that I've always recommended to our people out there, and it's the Johns Hopkins dashboard. So right now, we're worldwide a little over 20 million people who've been diagnosed with COVID-19. So it continues to obviously be a problem. It's not going away. It didn't go through a lull like we had hoped for in the summertime. I remember back in the spring, we talked about this idea of the uncertainty of how the virus is going to behave as we hit hotter and more humid weather. And it seems not to really have affected the virus much. Of the 20 million cases that have been diagnosed worldwide, the United States leads in the category of most number of people who are infected. And we're just over 5 million people who have been diagnosed in the United States. So almost a little around 25% of the total numbers are cases that are in the United States. That's followed now by Brazil. So North and South America are really the epicenters and have been for the last several months now, almost since March when the shift occurred. If you recall, historically, right, it started in the city of Wuhan in China. That was the epicenter for the longest time. Then the shift to Europe, specifically to Italy and other European countries. Then the shift to the United States by March and April. And that's really not diminished at all in terms of the epicenter, both North and South America. Of concern are the number of cases now in India, a little over 2 million cases in India. As you know, there's a large population there, and so that is also an area of concern. That's followed then by Russia, by South Africa, by Mexico, and by Western European countries have done relatively well lately, and we'll talk about that in a second. In terms of people who have died from this disease, it still remains a killer. And currently we have 744,000 deaths attributed to COVID-19 worldwide. Of those, 164,000 deaths in the United States. When we look specifically at the United States, we know there's been transitions of even the epicenters within the United States, right? We know that really the area of concern initially had been the New York, New Jersey area with a lot of cases. That now has diminished in New York and New Jersey and now spread through other parts of the country. And specifically in the last several weeks, although the numbers now may be leveling off a little bit, but certainly Florida remains a hot spot. Texas, parts of California, and sort of scattered throughout southern states, Mississippi, Alabama, and elsewhere. It seems to have penetrated into rural areas as well. We were initially looking at density of population, so that's been sort of a shift that rural areas are affected. And in the hotspot areas, we see the same pattern, which is number of cases that are diagnosed keep going up, number of hospitalizations go up, and number of deaths go up. So that's really kind of what's been going on. Than we have here in the United States. They had an initial surge of cases. It came down and then continued to go down. We had a surge of cases about 2 to 4 weeks after Europe. It came down, leveled off, and it leveled off, and then started increasing here in the United States. And that's the big difference between us and Europe, is that they've not necessarily seen that massive increase. Although honestly, some of the European countries are beginning to see slight numbers of increases in the last several weeks, increases in Spain, increases in France, for example. So this COVID-19 virus still remains a problem. And so we got to still be very, very careful. Again, a lot of issues here in the United States, specifically with the public health recommendations. Stay away from large gatherings of people. That's a no-no, right? That definitely puts you at higher risk. Continue to wear the mask when you're out in public, wash your hands, and just be very careful of connectivity with others. There is some promising news. I always hesitate saying that this is, the beginning of the end, because we don't know. This is science, and it's all about, the idea of research that's going on. And the biggest sort of surges in the last several weeks have been on the vaccine front. We know that right now there's around 20 vaccines worldwide. Phase 3 component of the trials, which now includes a whole lot more people that are volunteering to take the vaccine. And now we need to see how well the vaccine really works. So there's still a lot of work to be done. The optimists of the world will say that we may have some breakthroughs on the vaccine front in the fall, perhaps into winter, perhaps by early next year. Now, then the issue is, if something is deemed to work, then we got to figure out how we're going to produce it, right? Mass produce it, and how we're going to get it into people. You might have heard the recent news from Russia. They announced yesterday that they have a vaccine that works. This has become almost an international competition, if you will. And, to some extent, there's a little bit of skepticism on the Russian vaccine front, only because they've really not entered what would technically be phase 3 trials, which is a trial in a larger group of people. So they haven't shared necessarily their information or their data with the outside world. They say they have something that works and they're ready to start putting it into people. We're a little skeptical in terms of whether it's going to, all this is data driven. We'd love to see the data, and we'd love to see how things are moving ahead on the vaccine front. So that's kind of the update that I have in terms of where we're at in these last several weeks.
Thank you so much for that. And we got a comment saying that the video broke up. Did you say that there were 20 vaccines being researched right now?
Yeah, so roughly there's actually around 106, believe it or not, 165 vaccines worldwide that are in various sort of periods of study. Some are in the initial phases, and the initial phases are phases where someone's coming up with an idea and perhaps beginning to do animal studies, right? And so the typical studies are looking at whether in an animal model, oftentimes monkeys are using this, and I know there's a lot of sort of controversy about using animal studies. In this case, we need to use the animal study. It's an animal model to be able to see whether a vaccine candidate elicits an immune response, right? Whether it actually changes the immune system of an animal model. That's oftentimes the first phase. So there's a bunch of vaccines that are sort of at that initial point. You know, the vaccine world is really very much different than it used to be. There's all sorts of different manipulations and systems. There's genetic modifications. So it isn't like, I always say, it's not my parents' vaccine. It's a whole newfangled approach. There's 4 or 5 different sort of major ways of vaccine research now. But of those 165, roughly 20 or so are advanced enough to be now in the phase 2 or phase 3 trials, which is now being tried in humans. You know, this takes time. The Food and Drug Administration here in the United States, the commissioner did an op-ed piece last week in the Washington Post and really came out and said that although we're all wanting to get a vaccine as quickly as possible, there's in fact a U.S. government program called Operation Warp Speed to set up a vaccine. No one wants to get a vaccine out prematurely, even though we desperately all want one. No one wants something that will either A, be harmful to people, or B, not work. So there's a lot of movement out there. The U.S. government is heavily invested in 4 of those 20 vaccines. So the U.S. government basically has determined that 4 are decent or really good candidates. Some are based here in the United States, others are based in England, but they're putting money behind it with the idea that, you know, if it works, they want to start buying some of this vaccine as well. That's kind of the weird part of this whole vaccine world, right? On the one hand, we want the world to work together on research, right? And we want us to work together for the good of humanity. Unfortunately, sometimes it turns into now being a competition, right? Who's first? And then the reality is then you bring up the issue of health equity in society, right? Who gets the vaccine first, right? If we have something that works and we don't have a bunch of it, who determines, right, who gets it? There's actually a committee being set up through the U.S. government and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, is that, you know, they're beginning to look at who are the priority groups that need to be looked at in terms of the vaccine. This, in fact, was done in 2009 when we had the pandemic influenza, right? And at that point, we knew that at the beginning, we wouldn't have a bunch of this vaccine. So now we have to determine who are the high-risk groups. You know, I'll submit to you that one of the high-risk groups are who? Are healthcare workers, right? Are people who are out there every day taking care of individuals who are sick with COVID-19. That obviously is a group. Then you look at perhaps, you know, the high-risk groups in terms of people who are older age, right? They're at higher risk for getting bad COVID disease. People with chronic conditions and health conditions are also higher risk. But right now, a group is looking at this idea of prioritization. When it comes out, who's first in line?
It's good that there already is discussion about having a group to figure that out before the vaccine hits the market. And yeah, it is really concerning that everything is a competition when we're trying to help humanity, but we'll get there. There are lots of questions actually that have been asked so far. So I just want to scroll up to the top to make sure we don't miss any. One person asked, can we use the testing at UMD to return, move into campus, or do we have to get tested somewhere else? So I guess,
Yeah, so basically 2 options for students or faculty or staff who are returning. It's the either or option. If you want to go and get tested locally, we're just asking people to wait until I think the time period is 10 to 14 days before you return. We want to have a recent test. So we don't want people who were tested, for example, in June saying, aha, I was tested negative. Realize this is a group venture here, right? This is part of the TERP team, right? And nothing is perfect. I'll tell you, first of all, nothing's going to be perfect here because we know that if I got tested yesterday, that means I was negative yesterday, let's say, right? But I don't know what I am today, right? So this testing scheme is not necessarily the final answer, but it provides at least some information, right? It tells us within that 14-day period of returning to campus is were you positive or were you negative? If you happen to be positive, you fall into a different line, right? Somebody at your state level is going to tell you, here's what you need to do. You need to get into basically 14 days of a quarantine, right? You are a positive person, and therefore, you need to stay away from others. So that's an important part of this is you can either do it at the University of Maryland. I think we're starting the week of August 17th. It's 3 days a week for the following 3 weeks. And you should check with the COVID site at University of Maryland and get an appointment. I've done it twice already, right? So I did it with the testing in June, and then I did it with the testing in July. And both times I had an appointment. You show up at the stadium, right? There's people there to direct you. They try to set it up so that we're avoiding large crowds of people. So even if there's a line, you're staying 6 feet away from each other and wearing a mask. It's done very professionally, and overall, it's very quick. Is it uncomfortable? Nobody likes having a big Q-tip stuck up your nose, let's be honest, right? It sometimes, it's not painful. What it does, it causes a little bit of tearing, a little bit of almost a sneeze reflex that potentially comes on. But, it's done very quickly, both nostrils, one side for about 20 seconds, the other side for about 20 seconds, and then you're done. So we're asking everybody, faculty, staff, and students to be tested so that we understand where we're starting from. If you are positive, you'll be given further recommendations, further instructions. If you're negative, that's a good thing, but don't change your behaviors because you're negative, right? Don't do that, right? Still be careful. Just because you're negative doesn't mean that you are, somehow not susceptible to catching it from others, right? So just be really careful with these things. It's, I think, a good approach. There's no perfect approach to reopening. No school, no university, no company, no part of industry has come up with the perfect plan. We're trying our best, and what we're trying to do is, under these very strange circumstances, to assure the safety and health of everybody who's part of our community.
Mm-hmm. And I think for out-of-state students, you had, the guidance said that you had to be tested closer to when you're arriving to campus, because I'm an out-of-state student, and it said it was recommended 72 hours before you go to campus.
Right. So look at the recommendations. Those have been changing to some extent. They should be pretty solid right now, but do read carefully what's on our COVID-19 site.
Mm-hmm. And then just following up with that, a question a few of my friends have asked were around the pre-testing and then the post-arrival testing. So could you explain just what the background is as to why we should get tested twice, or what the science is behind that?
Right. There's, again, no perfect science, and we're still there's still further an evolution of what's going on. As I mentioned, that what we're afraid of is people thinking that a negative means you're negative for the rest of your life, right? Again, any kind of connections with others, any break in terms of your public health prevention methods can put you at risk. You go to a party, you show up at, some bar, you're not wearing your mask properly, you're doing all these things, or just plain bad luck, being around a person who happens to be a super spreader, right? For that reason, what we're trying to instill at the university is at least a follow-on testing regimen. And part of this is still being developed. Part of it is either that everybody gets retested, and I think that's part of the scheme. Part of it is the idea that We may do sort of random testing of small groups of individuals. We're also looking at potentially, and this is sort of an interesting part of the research world, and this would apply to people who are staying on campus, and this sounds kind of funky, but in fact it does work, is doing surveillance testing of specific buildings, i.e., let's say you're in a dorm, right? As opposed to just testing all the individuals in the dorm. Guess what what's at least being proposed, and I think potentially going to be funded, is going to be testing of the wastewater that comes from the dorm, right? So what happens with COVID-19, if you happen to have COVID-19, guess what? When you're in the bathroom, it comes out, right? So as the wastewater goes into the sewer system, again, research, public health, we actually take samples of the sewage that's coming out of dorm X and testing that, right? And if there happens to be positives there, then we know we may have to go into that dorm and test everybody there, right? If it's a negative, then we're sort of assured. That's the reason I bring that up, is that really is kind of almost a research protocol, but it shows you, right? I keep mentioning every time we have this phone call, this all started on December 31st, 2019. So you do the math. We're 8.5 months into this. We're still learning each step of the way about this virus. So again, the testing schemes is sort of still, look at the site at the University of Maryland site, because what I say may in fact be changing, as we look at this, right, as it goes on. But the whole idea is being retested is a potential important issue, because we know the incubation period of this is roughly 10 to 14 days, which is after contact. It tends to take 10 to 14 days for me to develop a positive. So if I did this, often enough, then I'll be safer, right? There was an interesting study. It came out of Harvard a few weeks ago, and they talked about this is a modeling study. So again, we're learning all the time. We're also throwing this into sort of models that are being built, right? Mathematical models. And their model was a college campus. I think it was something on the order of 8,000 or 10,000 students living on a college campus. And the assumption was something like 16 students were coming in as positives, right, at the beginning. And their sort of conclusion was, in order to prevent spread of disease, the best thing to do is to test everybody every 2 days. Well, that's not really possible, but that just shows you how we're still not fully certain of how this needs to be done and done correctly. So
I wish we had the resources to do that and the manpower.
Well, the other thing, Kelly, is it's not only the resources, it's also, we're still waiting for simplicity of the testing, right? Because right now, the way it's being set up is I need to sit down, somebody with PPE, right? A face shield, a mask, fully gowned and gloved, comes at me with a big Q-tip and sticks it in my nose. We'd love, and there are sort of research protocols that are now developing. I want to simplify that, right? And the simple thing is you're sitting in your dorm room at home, and actually you're spitting into a little vial. And then I do the test off of that spit, as opposed to that. You do it yourself. I don't have to introduce somebody from the medical care side to stick something up your nose, and it becomes simpler and simpler. That's where we want to be. We also want rapid answers, right? Because right now, even the time period when I did it in June and July, it took about 3 to 5 days for me to get my results back from the University of Maryland. That's a long waiting period, right? And again, what's under development right now are not only simplified testing, but in fact, rapid tests, where you get the answer in minutes or hours as opposed to days, right? That also will be helpful for us. So a lot of work being done.
Definitely. And going off of just talking about like the lag time in between testing and then actually receiving your results, I got tested a few weeks ago at CVS, and I had to wait 16 days for my results to come back. And after 16 days, it really didn't help me at all. But so what should individuals do in the in-between time, like when they get tested for COVID-19 and receive their results?
Again, 16 days is preposterous, right? I mean, it's a broken system, because, we can't tell everybody, okay, really, for 16 days, you're sitting on a bubble saying, do I have it or not? I assume in your case, I'm not going to ask you questions, that most people are coming in asymptomatic. So it's not like they're sick and being tested, right? So what we want to know just to be able to help. I mean, all I'm telling people is that, hopefully at the University of Maryland, again, we're talking about not weeks, but days. Days is still too long for me as a public health person, but that's the best I have right now. And in the meantime, just be really careful, right? Continue doing it. Don't, I'm talking to the students and the faculty and staff who may be listening to this right now, right? Don't let your guard down, right? Don't let just because you're feeling fine doesn't mean that you're negative. And just because you're negative doesn't mean that you can traipse around and pretend that this disease isn't out there, right? It's still being transmitted. So be real careful. Put on the mask, wash the hands, stay away from large groups. It's as simple as that.
And then going off of the mask thing, there was a question submitted about the biggest concerns about wearing masks and improper use of masks. Someone's seen people just taking them off when they're talking to people, or just covering their mouths and not their noses. So they were wondering, will there be signs emphasizing covering your mouth and your nose, and just how to properly wear a mask?
Yeah, and I think that that's critical. We want everybody to sort of go through the COVID-19. There's a training module that's online, right? And part of that is proper mask wearing. Part of it is understanding what the mask is really doing. And part of it we need to sort of circulate out there. Part of this is going to be peer pressure, right? Is the whole idea. If you notice somebody not wearing their mask correctly, turn to them and say, hey, listen, you're not protecting me and you're not protecting yourself, right? So the whole idea of, I'll be the first to admit it, right? I'm a mask wearer, but I'm still looking for the most comfortable mask out there. I got for Father's Day a beautiful gift from my kids, and I should have it here somewhere, but it's a Terps mask, right? So it's got, testudo on it, it's Maryland, it's red, it's all good. But that thing, it's like wearing flannel pajamas in the middle of summer. It is so damn hot underneath that mask. So now I'm sort of looking for, again, cloth masks, thicker the better, right? They're talking about, having at least several layers in there and all. And it's going to be a comfort thing. Find something that's comfortable that works, right? Bandanas by themselves, even though the state and CDC mentioned bandanas, or thin things that you can see through, are not going to do the trick, right? They're not going to do the trick. I'll be honest with you. People are going to be wearing them, but not going to do the trick. The other big thing out there that really is a big, big mistake is some of the masks that people are wearing, you'll notice, have a little valve on them. There's like a little plastic piece. Those are no-nos. Those should be thrown out in the midst of this. Valves are bad, okay? Because valves, the reason valves are put into those are for industrial processes, right? So it protects me, right? When I'm, let's say, exposed to hydrogen sulfide or something in an industrial setting. But what it doesn't do is the reason the valve is there is when I breathe out, it makes it easier for me to breathe out. So the valve pops open, right? But with COVID-19, that's not what you want, right? So especially people out there, right? If you see somebody wearing a mask with a valve, explain to them that the valve may make it more comfortable, but it is the incorrect mask to be wearing at this time, right? Because it pops open every time you sneeze inside that mask, every time you cough inside that mask, every time you speak inside that mask, every time you breathe out. And that's the last thing we need right now, is for all that to be coming out while people think that they're protected.
I did not know that, and I've seen so many people wear those masks and just walk around completely normal. I'll definitely bring that up when I see people.
Yeah, no, it's just one of those things that we're just not getting the public health message out there regarding the valves.
Yeah. And then just going down, the next question asked is, being on the UMD COVID task force, why are the commons and courtyards facilities not de-densifying to 48% capacity, as outlined in the For Maryland protocol you helped author?
Yeah, so, part of the issue is, where do we have control of things or not? Now, the latest numbers that I got this morning in terms of residencies that are under full control of the University of Maryland, I think as of this morning, capacity is, I think, 41%. So, we've had all these deadlines where people can opt out. So I'm actually quite comfortable. I mean, the majority, if not everybody, right, is going to be in singles, right? That's the reality. When, I think our capacity overall is something like 8,800 spots on campus residencies. And so we're going to be 43% filled, right? So that leaves a lot of space. When we talk about other entities that are not fully controlled by the University of Maryland, right? And this includes not only private apartments, right, that are out there in College Park, but also other facilities that are contractual, right, that take our students, but in fact are run by private entities. We're trying our best to make sure that these private entities do the right thing, but I have no control over that, right? The University of Maryland doesn't. So what we're trying to make sure is that the students sort of understand what they're getting themselves into, and specifically the idea that even if you're in a multi-group, housing, whether you're in a private apartment, if you're in part of these private ventures that are out there, try to maintain that 6-foot distance and try to wear the masks even indoors when others are around, right? Or opt out if you can. I mean, there's no simple answer
here. Mm-hmm. And then just going down to the next question asked, you kind of touched on this earlier, but is there a plan for how often all students on campus will get tested during the semester?
Yeah, that's still sort of an evolution as I understand it. There's a separate testing group. I'm a co-chair of the task force that's on, health, safety, and risk mitigation. We've now sort of had several members of that task force sit on the testing task force, sit on others. And I think we're still in evolution right now in terms of what's going to be done in terms of regularity of testing. Right. I think part of the plan was that we would do small groups of people, 1,000 here, 1,000 there, sort of surveillance testing to see what's going on campus. The key feature is that, first of all, the testing is being run out of the University Health Center. So they are in charge. Why is that important? It's important for everybody to understand is if you're ill, if you're sick, right, you let them know. Right. So first of all, if you have any of the symptoms of COVID-19, amongst them fever, cough, sneezing, right, this whole idea of feeling run down, there's a whole list of symptoms. Interesting symptom that came up sort of as a novelty within COVID-19 is the loss of smell and taste, right? Mm-hmm. Diarrhea sometimes is part of it. So really monitor your health. If you don't feel well, right, and you're living on campus or intending to come to campus, you're supposed to fill out a form every day that says, I'm not feeling well. That'll then direct you to have to talk to somebody at the University Health Center. If you're feeling bad, you will be tested, right? So the reality is there's no waiting period. There's no nothing, right? If you have symptoms that are consistent with COVID-19, you're there and they're going to be taking care of you. It's the rest of us who are asymptomatic, right? And so the testing regimen that we're sort of considering is how do you do that well when you have thousands of people back on campus, and how do you sort of implement that? And that's still unfolding to a large extent, right? So we're going to do a little bit of the surveillance stuff. I mentioned the whole idea that, if we do get the funding for the wastewater testing, that provides another element of testing. The reality is this COVID-19 virus is out there in society. We cannot put up barricades, right, around College Park and basically say, we're going to keep it away from here. We're not. Mm-hmm. It's going to be around there. And the question is, how are we going to be good enough to pick it up quickly?
Mm-hmm. And when more students come to campus, do you think there'll be any possibility for student volunteers to be helpful throughout the process, or even SPH terps to get involved with some of the contact tracing or different things like handing out masks or whatever?
Yeah, we're still looking at sort of, I've talked about sort of our relationship over the course of summer where we had a handful of students helping Prince George's County, so helping our community in terms of contact tracing. We hope to continue that to some extent. And we'd like to sort of instill this idea of using the public health school students right, as those ambassadors, if you will, of public health information, right? The question is how to best do that. As you know, the plans have changed as of a few days ago, right? So the reality is that we're kind of kicking the can down the road regarding the in-person classes, right? So now we've added like another couple of weeks beyond August 31st to say everything's going to be online. So the first sort of re-entry of people onto campus really are going to be the people who are coming back to live on campus or live around campus, right? What I'd like all of my public health students to do is, you know, whether I'm organizing you or whether you, a public health person, sort of deputize yourself. You raise your hands and say, I understand. I'm going to learn everything there is to know about COVID-19 prevention, and I'm going to be that ambassador in my community, right? Because we may not be in the same classrooms together. We may not be at the same campus together. But I need all of you at the School of Public Health, all public health students, to basically say is, I will speak out. As you mentioned, if you see somebody wearing a mask that has a valve, right, it's not being discourteous. You're in fact providing information saying that valve really is not recommended because you're just spewing this stuff out, right? So change masks. People wearing incorrect masks, people, those things. So whether we're organizing it from the School of Public Health or whether you're out there as ambassadors, we'll figure out something to try to engage students as we get in and understand our dynamics at the School of Public Health in particular, but you should feel empowered. First, learn everything there is about this disease and its prevention, and then become the ambassadors.
And just going off of recent updates, like you mentioned, that our classes will be online the first 2 weeks of the semester. What do you foresee like the benefit of that being? Like, do you think students will quarantine for 2 weeks, like when they first get to campus, or is it just to like make sure that our classrooms are equipped properly?
Yeah, I think there's several things going on. One of which is we want to make sure that the system works, right? And so part of this is how are we going to get all this information about people testing positive or negative? I see a question out there is we're still sort of looking at the idea of, you know, being tested before you come campus and then when you're at campus. So we're going to have the extra time to sort of evolve into a testing program on campus. It buys us a little bit of time. You know, there's this sense that, you know, and again, you know, different schools are handling this differently. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you a big secret. I don't know what the right answer is. I don't know. And I've been a public health practitioner my whole career, right? 28 years in the federal government as a public health officer. So the reality is that what we're doing right now is trying to figure out the best approach. So these 2 weeks buy us a little time where we aren't putting everybody into the classroom setting. Yet what we have is we have a cohort of students who are back and living on campus, right? So it allows us to basically get good at that first stage. Then if things go well in that first stage, we start another step. And that step is, as you know, it's 10 to 20% of classes will be offered in person. Then you go into that in-person mode. Mm-hmm. You know, the controversy right now is, you know, some schools have basically gone all online because, once again, we're not where we thought we would be when it comes to the pandemic. The hope was that right now in August, I would see a complete lull in activity. That was my hope. And so welcoming people back to campus would have been really cool, right? We would have been braced for it. We probably would have done the same thing. The danger right now is reopening fully, which we're not doing, right? We're not having all in-person classes, so we're doing the right thing, but reopening fully as we see that the pandemic still continues. And it's not really what's happening just in Maryland and Prince George's County. It's what's happening throughout the United States and throughout the world. Students are coming back from all over. I have to try to create a safe environment.
That's so true. I think I've read a few articles where it was talking about how universities closed down after a couple hundred cases in the US, and then now we're up to the millions and we're reopening, which is just an interesting concept. But we are reopening with the proper guidance, or not even proper, just what we're trying to do and what will mitigate the risk at the most.
Yeah, and I think that that's important. You know, let me just interrupt for 1 second, because I think this is critical, is that, guess what? Even when we closed down back in March, What were the recommendations regarding mask wear, right? I'll remind you.
Oh, no.
Even
Nobody
the
has.
Surgeon General of the United States, position I formerly held, right, as an acting Surgeon General. Surgeon General said, do not wear masks, American public, right? Masks should be worn by healthcare professionals, right? And the fear was, it was still a decent fear, was everybody's going to run on masks and there aren't going to be enough masks for the healthcare professionals. Now, within a few months of that edict, we're now saying, oh my God, you're not wearing a mask? That's not the right thing. So this keeps evolving, right? Yes, we're trying to reopen in the midst of a pandemic continuing, but we're also instilling many more different features than we did back in March. And masks are a typical example of that, right? We are now a mask-filled society. Like it or not, that's the public health approach.
Yeah. And I feel like every day we're getting new headlines from like emails or ESPN or anything. Like I remember getting the headline saying that Big Ten sports aren't going to be happening in the fall, which is very discouraging to all of our student athletes and then just people who love to watch sports. But do you think that this decision helps with the mitigation process, or like is it harmful to the individuals who would be competing?
Well, it's interesting. So one of my many duties these last few months was former President Lowe, right, of our university, put me on a task force with the Big Ten. It's called the Task Force on Emerging Infectious Diseases. So I'm the University of Maryland representative on that. Been meeting every single Monday since March, right, with representatives of the other 13 schools of the Big Ten. And, that group basically is a resource for the commissioner of the Big Ten conference, right? To basically bounce ideas off of and to seek recommendations from. And it's a group of physicians, public health people, health and safety people. So every school has representatives on that. And there's been evolution even in that approach. So it first starts off, and my entry was, it's almost bizarre because I always think to myself, how interesting it is to be a dean of a school of public health in the midst of all this, right? Because I never would have imagined when I left government, when I took off the uniform of the public health service, that I would be so engaged in a major public health crisis like this, again. But my first few meetings was talking about the tournament, right? The March Madness tournament.
Maryland is going to win it all.
Exactly. And I was there at the meetings where we went from, oh my God, something's happening with this COVID-19. Oh my God, we're going to continue with the tournament, but no crowds are going to be allowed in the stadium, to, oh my God, we're canceling the tournament. So, I can say, not just me, but we played a role in terms of getting the public health approach out there. In the same fashion, being a member of this task force on emerging infectious diseases, we've been meeting with the commissioner since March, first coming up with a game plan of saying, okay, now that we've settled with the basketball season, we have to look at, right, the fall sports. And it's not just football, but football, honestly, is the biggie, right? And it's big because what? Because it's actually a revenue producer, right? A lot of money comes in for all universities, from the ESPN contracts, from TV with other networks, et cetera, et cetera. And we have a lot of student athletes whose passion is that. But at some point we began planning for the fall season and saying, okay, so we're going to reopen. This is going to be great. We started with recommendations of how the student athlete would be welcome to campus, how they would be, come in the summertime. That was almost the first line of people returning to campus, right? It was really the researchers came back. Staff had been there all along, essential staff. Some people were working throughout this whole thing to keep the university moving, right? So those were the first two groups that were always on campus, or the researchers came later. So essential staff, followed by the researchers, followed by the student athlete. And we had, come up with the recommendations. Here's how testing is going to unfold. Here's how practices need to go, right? And then we started talking about the season. And we were at the point 3-4 weeks ago, this task force, of saying, okay, here's the testing regimen for the student athlete. And is the student athlete different than a student? Yeah, kind of, right? because the reality is they're doing several things that others aren't doing. One is specifically in football, you're in a contact sport where you're right next to people. The 6-foot rule doesn't apply, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's, even flag football is still, you're coming close, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is, this is something that puts you at higher risk. Secondly, you're traveling potentially to other schools, right? And so therefore, we set up a regimen of testing. The recommended regimen was that student athletes in football would be tested every Monday and every Thursday, right? Makes sense. Weekend game took place. Monday, you're being
Mm-hmm.
tested. Thursday is right before the next game, right? And, did all of us feel super comfortable this was the right approach? Well, it's certainly aggressive, right? But we're not sure how it's going to work. Then this evolved over the last couple of weeks with really just fascinating sessions with the Big Ten commissioner where, decisions needed to be made. And ultimately, I think this group played a key role in that, which was what? This is really going to be tough to implement, right? Look at professional sports, right?
Mm-hmm.
2 baseball teams that were severely affected. Baseball season's going on. They got better. But, this is millions of dollars that baseball and basketball is putting into testing people all the time. One can argue, how much of an investment do we need to put into sports? I'm not going to go there. But the reality is to make this work efficiently would be a whole lot of resources. And then secondly, and this is part of the bothersome feature, remember I kept saying how we're learning about COVID-19 all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we don't know fully what are the long-term repercussions of having COVID-19 disease. Some people are having problems months later, right? There's also some information talking about cardiac issues, right? So heart issues after having COVID-19. Some people are developing neurological issues, clotting disorders, strokes, things like that. How does that play a role in the student athlete, right? If their heart is pumping and their blood is circulating at higher levels, right? So I think part of it was the due diligence, not just how do we protect a bunch of football players from getting COVID-19, but if I don't fully understand this disease, how do I put people at risk further for potential long-term repercussions? And, we made a lot of enemies, perhaps doing this. I mean, there are people, and again, my heart goes out to our student athletes who are waiting for the big season, to start. But, I got to tell you, nothing works. Athletics doesn't work. The economy doesn't work. The nation doesn't work unless we're healthy. And that's what I'm trying to assure here.
Thank you so much for giving us that insight and also just like talking about the Big Ten conference that you're a part of. Another question that we have is, how do you plan to mitigate the risk of new undergraduates attending UMD next year in relation to those who are already on campus?
So you're saying next year or this coming year?
So this coming year.
Yeah. So again, we're welcoming the new students, right? I'm not promising that this year is going to be unlike, that this year is going to be a standard year. It is not, mm-hmm. right? What we're trying to do is trying to ride that fine line, right? Between the idea, let's be honest. Part of the fun of being on campus coming in, let's say as a freshman, is all of a sudden, right? You're on this big campus and you want to make friends and you want to meet people and you want to see all the clubs and you want to be active. Yes, you want to go to sporting events. This year is going to be a modification of that. And the question is, how do I modify it so that I give you an experience at the campus level without putting you or others at undue risk? And that's going to be a biggie, right? So the whole issue of large group gatherings, right? I know Student Affairs is trying to organize things, some of them virtual. Nobody's happy with huge virtual meetings, but that's one way of doing it, right? Is socializing through that mechanism. Small group get-togethers where people wear masks and stay 6 feet away from each other, right? Not the perfect scenario, but what we're trying to do is instill this, for Maryland spirit, right? Again, look at the website about the for Maryland approach. And the idea is brand new students coming in. It's not going to be a perfect introduction to our campus because it's usually so much better. Mm-hmm. Now, under this circumstance, we're trying to do as best as we can to welcome you into campus, to make you feel that you're part of the Turf family, and to try to get the ball rolling, right? If we do this right, and if this in combination with potential treatments and the vaccine, things will get better from here. But right now, we have to do, due diligence to trying to prevent this further spread of this virus.
Yeah, and going off
And I'm just looking at myself here. I just noticed that people are probably wondering, if you've seen me before, this is the longest my hair has been since probably 35 years. So it's a little unruly. So give me a break.
You haven't tried the at-home haircut yet?
One of my daughters actually was volunteering for it, but then I decided, I'm just going to let it grow because I've not had it this long in 35 years. So, I'm just seeing how it goes.
No, it looks great. And honestly, it's like a luck thing. It's like for like the playoffs and stuff, just grow out your beard.
Exactly.
Like, who cares?
Exactly.
It's luck right now.
Yeah.
That's like Dr. Fauci's first pitch a few weeks ago. Like, I kind of like that it wasn't that great because it showed that he was more focused on COVID and doing that stuff instead of practicing baseball in his backyard.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dean Lushniak, for just answering all of these questions and everything throughout the summer and last semester. This is our last session for the summer session, but we're exploring potentially bringing it forward next semester, maybe twice a month, and just having a space for students to ask questions and then just make sure that they're answered and everybody feels up to date about COVID and being back on campus, and then any transitions that might happen in the fall. And then Dean Lushniak, if you want to say any last words.
Yeah, I think, again, to our listeners out there, and if you're viewing this live, that's great. If you're viewing on a recording later on, do give us feedback at the School of Public Health, at our, you can do at the Dean's account. If you're liking these sessions, we'd like to hear back from you. Right. So let us know, right? What do you want and how you want us to work it, right? I give my accolades to Kelly for doing a great job and volunteering for this, right? Way back when. Little did we know that we'd still be at it, right? All these months later. But I appreciate your professionalism, Kelly, and your interest in terms of trying to get the word out. But to our listeners out there, if this is good, let us know. If it sucks, let us know how we make it better. What we'll then do is try to figure out what's the best way of connecting up as we go into our fall term, right? And it's a way for us to somebody wrote in, to stay connected and informed. I think, this is a good way for me as the dean to at least, say that, one, I care about you all. Two, I miss you all. I really don't like this virtual deanship. You don't like being virtual students. Our professors don't like being virtual teachers. But right now, it's the right thing to be doing, right? Once again, I'll put in that plug, be ambassadors. Study this disease, learn about its prevention, and start educating people. Start with your family and friends and your community. This is important, right? And what I'd like you to think about, as public health students, and this is a way to sort of inspire activism at some level. At some point, this is all going to be history. And at some point, someone's going to ask you, what did you do during the great COVID-19 pandemic? And I want you to have a good answer, right? I want you to say, it doesn't have to be that I'm the one who discovered the vaccine, right? We'd all like to be that person. But what did you do, right? What did you do for the good of your family? And it doesn't have to be all earth-shattering, inspiring. But did you learn about this disease? Did you learn about yourself? Did you learn about interacting with others in a new way? Think about it now. Start journaling or writing this down because, folks, this is history. Right? This is history. And at some point, this will be history looking back. Right now, we're living it. These are never going to be. There's a Carly Simon song called These Are the Good Old Days. These aren't the good old days. People are dying. People are suffering economic hardship. People are are suffering racism and health disparities. And so these are not the good old days. But someday we'll look back at this and say, what did we learn during these bad old days? So thank you much. Keep it up.
And just to reiterate, please do send feedback about this. And if you are getting anything from this or not, you can email the SPH comms email, or you could just even DM this Instagram account or leave a comment so we could look at it. And I hope you all have a great rest of your week and stay healthy.
Great.
All right.
See you all.
Bye.